Welcome, everyone. Tonight we have our third episode with Gary Lachman. Gary Lachman is a dedicated metaphysician, a mystic, and a successful author of many books about consciousness, mysticism, metaphysics, culture, and the Western esoteric tradition. Tonight, Gary will delve into how the past few centuries, humanity has been moving toward a possible completion of our partial mind, a union between the two halves of our brains, in which is now dominant, the analytic half is going to be complemented by its marginalized intuitive partner. You will also know Gary as he chunked, shredded, and blistered behind his bass guitar as a founding member of the pop rock group Blondie. In 2006, he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Tonight, we are honored to have Gary present the third episode in our three-part series of Esotericism and the Evolution of Consciousness, here with us tonight at the Theosophical Society headquarters out of London, England. Tonight's final segment is called Toward the Integral Mind, and this is all based on his book, which you could pick up if you'd like to, and you should. It is called The Secret Teachers of the Western World. Please give Gary a follow over on Twitter at Gary Lachman on Twitter, and you can visit his website, garylachman.co.uk. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to the one, the only, Gary Lachman.
Wow, after that, thank you so much. Yes, okay. Let's see, I want to get onto screen share here. So share, right. So we're going with it. All right, well, thank you very much. And thank you everybody for attending. And yes, I'm going to try and wrap it up as it were. The title of this third part is Toward the Integral Mind, and it's the notion of integrating the two sides of our brain, which is kind of from the E. McGilchrist point of view. And as I said in the very first lecture, this history of the esoteric tradition that I'm looking at in terms of evolutionary consciousness is through the lens of the ideas about it from two different thinkers. One was Ian McGilchrist, who his book Master and Emissaries, he reboots the whole two sides of our brain story, and the other is the work called Ever-Present Origin by Jean Gebser, who's a German-Swiss philosopher, not as well known, but equally important, who talks about different mutations of consciousness. And they're both interested in integrating these two opposites or two polarizations of how we can understand the world. And I just want to quickly run through here some people I had to leave out. I've had to leave out quite a bit. There's a lot of things I have not got around to talk about at all. I can only name check some of them. But I'm going to try and quickly run through just right now some people that should have been in the last talk, but I had to leave them out. And the first one here is Paracelsus, who's an alchemist. I haven't had a chance to talk about alchemy too much. I mentioned it about how with the Hermetic diaspora from Alexandria and other places with the rise of Christianity, it moved into the Arabic world, and then with the rise of Islam, it was much of it with the Aristotelian slant was picked up by the Arab philosophers and developed and found its way back to the West in around the 11th century. People like Albertus Magnus and even Thomas Aquinas and so on and so on. But Paracelsus, he was known as the Hermes of the North, and he was an alchemist, but he wasn't one of the puffers. He wasn't trying to turn lead into gold, or in a metaphorical sense, but not in the kind of actual sense. But he worked with kind of plant essences, we would say today. And he was a remarkable, contrary, kind of ornery character, like many of these great mages and sages were. And he was known for his very controversial and scandalous sayings and behavior and so on. And he traveled across all of Europe. He was part of armies, and he learned his trade as a physician in the army as a surgeon. And so he was doing sort of surgery on the battlefield, as it were. And one of the things that Paracelsus, this is a name that he adopted. It means greater than Celsus. Celsus was one of the great physicians and healers of the ancient world, and para means greater than or above. And so his real name is Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. And there was an old story that our term bombast, or somebody being bombastic, is very loud and making very extravagant claims, comes from Paracelsus, because his character was like that. But actually bombast is a sort of kind of stuffing made of cotton that's used in certain sorts of kind of works and things like that. So it doesn't quite go like that, but it makes sense that it would, because he was that kind of character. He's very loud, abrasive, and very forthcoming. But among other things that he discovered was, he's known as the father of iatrochemistry, which is sort of like medicine using, well, the beginning of medicine, using drugs to deal with ailments and things like that. And the main drug that he used was opium. This was the panacea at the time. And if you remember, we're talking about the 1500s. So there was nothing like any kind of anesthetic other than alcohol around at the time, with things like that. And opium actually does have miraculous powers. It actually can heal you from quite a few things, whatever it might be. So Paracelsus sort of pioneered the use of it in a variety of ways. And he rebelled against the sort of learned doctors at the time who they wouldn't touch surgery, they wouldn't do anything like that, they wouldn't get their hands dirty in any way whatsoever, but they always knew what Aristotle had said, or Galen, who was another great physician in the past. And Paracelsus said, basically burn all those books and go to nature and learn from nature. And he was a hermeticist and an alchemist in the sense that he worked under the notion of the correspondences between the macrocosmos and the microcosmos. And human beings were a small universe themselves. And he talked about the inner firmament, which he meant our inner world. And he's very much about developing the imagination in order to sort of explore and make use of the relationships, the correspondences between the inner world and the outer world. So like Suhrawardy, if you remember from the last talk, who talked about the imagination and going on these inner journeys into the imaginal world, the mundus imaginalis, as Henri Corbin called it, and as Jung himself talked about later on, and he goes into the collective unconscious with his own inner journeys. Paracelsus is doing this as well. And he talks about developing the imagination as this kind of precise instrument. And he's very early on someone who's talking about psychosomatic illnesses where the imagination can affect the body. And he believed in sort of action at a distance and how his own imagination could affect someone at a distance. And he talks about being able to actually stab someone with a kind of psychic dagger and so on. I mean, this could be bluff and, braggadocio, but at the same time, he certainly was one of the great advocates of developing the imagination to be able to explore this inner firmament. And he talks about able to see into nature as one would see into a glass. And that's very much along the same lines as what this fellow here, Jakob Böhme, talked about. And he didn't have quite as explosive or adventurous a career as Paracelsus. Paracelsus is one of these great esoteric travelers. He just walked all over Europe. He walked to Siberia and so on and so on. Jakob Böhme pretty much stayed in his hometown in Bohemia. And he was known as sort of the mystic cobbler, which is not, I don't mean in the sense of a pastry. I don't know if you know, that's an American joke. It's a kind of a peach cobbler. He was a cobbler in the sense that he was able to bang on, make shoes and all that. But one day he saw a dish, a pewter dish, and the sunlight glinting on it. He looked at it and it sent him into this kind of trance. And he said that he learned more in a quarter of an hour than if he had spent, years at a university, which, that meant a lot then. It's kind of common knowledge these days. But, if you look at the universities, what they're doing. But back then it was he's had this remarkable, sudden, direct perception into the same kind of vision that Paracelsus talks about, being able to see into nature as into a glass. And you can see the inner properties of things. And Böhme talks about the signature of things and being able to see their kind of essence. And borrowing from Paracelsus, he wrote these absolutely difficult, obscure works on a kind of alchemical metaphysics in order to explain what he meant by seeing into the signature of things. And he talks about being these two different worlds, this world of wrath and a world of love. And the world that we live in is the third world. That's the battleground between these two forces. And this in a way goes back to the ancient Greeks. Empedocles, the pre-Socratic, he talked about love and strife being the two fundamental forces at work and the different dialectic between them. Böhme is talking about something like that at the same time, but he is trying to explain this vision that he has of how the universe works in terms of these triads and sulfur and mercury and salt and things of that sort that he picks up from Paracelsus. And if you remember from at the end of the last talk, Paracelsus is just before kind of the downfall of Hermes Trismegistus, because we left it in around 1614 when Itzhak Casaubon, who's this humanist scholar, who was asked to write a critical review of this long history of the church, and this is all going on during the the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. And so he's, and this is by, I think it was like John the First or something. So it's England trying to find this kind of typical middle way between the extremes of the Catholic, side and the ultra sort of Protestant side. And so Itzhak Casaubon is basically given this job of reading and sort of reviewing this long, massive history of the church. And he's not setting out to try and undermine Hermes Trismegistus, but in the midst of doing that, he realizes that the Hermetic texts, which were thought to have been written at some time before the flood and to have influenced Plato and also to have sort of presaged Christianity and so on, couldn't have been written at that time because the Greek that they're written in is from a much later Greek, a more recent Greek. It's the Greek of Alexandria, which is the birthplace of much of these things. So at a stroke, Hermes Trismegistus' prestige, his street cred, is kind of undermined, and it takes a while for this to filter down into other people realizing this. He couldn't tweet about it as we could today, so there wasn't instantaneous transmission of the fact that, oh my God, we've discovered this. But strangely enough, as history would have it, or some strange synchronicity would have it in history, that in the same year that Itzhak Casaubon undermines Hermes Trismegistus, and it's around the same time that Boehm is writing his books. Hermes is sort of a century earlier in the 1500s. These strange pamphlets appear in a city in Germany called Kassel, and this is the beginning of the Rosicrucian phenomena. And these pamphlets announce the arrival of this unknown, mysterious brotherhood, known as the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross, or as they're later known as the Rosicrucians. And the pamphlets talk about this universal kind of a shift, a change in Europe, the beginning of a new religious tolerance and a new kind of social tolerance and a sense of wider openings, a much more progressive kind of view, we would say. And fundamentally, it predicts a kind of release from the Habsburg, the Habsburg authority of the Catholic Church at the time. So it's part of the sort of Protestant kind of Reformation movement there. And it talks about this brotherhood, the Rosicrucians, who are preaching a kind of what they call pan-Sophy, which is sort of all knowledge. And it's a union of the Hermetic sciences, which are on their way out, although, again, Casaubon's bombshell, the effect of it hadn't reached yet. So it's a strange synchronicity at the same time that Hermes Trismegistus' street credibility is undermined, that this mysterious secret brotherhood appears and is talking about a new age on its way of a union of the sort of the Hermetic sciences with the rise of the new natural sciences and things of that sort. And several pamphlets turn up in other places at the same time, and they tell this wonderful story of this figure named Christian Rosenkreutz, who a few centuries earlier went on a journey to the east, this kind of initiatory journey that many of these people we've been talking about go on. And he found much wisdom in the Holy Land and in North Africa and so on. And he comes back to Europe and he wants to share what he has learned, but no one's really interested and no one will share the knowledge they have. They're all, very selfishly protecting the little bits of information that they have and all that. And he tries and tries, but no one will, pay any attention to what he has to say. So he decides to sort of find other people with whom he can share this and start a kind of brotherhood. And this is the original Rosicrucians. And they have this mission where they go out to different lands and they adopt the ways of life and the dress code and all that sort of thing of wherever they are. When in Rome, do as the Romans. But they will secretly try to interject into the world that they find themselves in, this Hermetic teaching and this mystic wisdom that Christian Rosenkreuz had found in his journeys. And this goes on for a while, and then he dies. He lived to some remarkable age, they say 114 or something like that. And then he is buried in this fantastic sort of vault inside this temple that he had built for his followers to meet. Every year they come back from wherever they are, and they discuss and talk about whatever they developed and how things are going. They have a board meeting, as it were. And over time, people sort of forget about him, and things lose touch with each other. And there's some remaining members, like a century or so later, and they're doing some renovation on their temple, and they rediscover his vault, the vault of Christian Rosenkreuz, and they open it, and his body is perfectly preserved, and there are all these fantastic kind of scientific and weird kind of instruments, globes and odd things like that, and a kind of miniature sun, and there are texts by Paracelsus and all this kind of thing. And the people who discover this decide that they're going to carry on with this tradition. And this is supposed to be the Rosicrucians that are announcing their arrival. And they say to everyone, come join us. But no one can find them. Everyone who tries to look for them can never find them anywhere. And then it becomes what is known as the Rosicrucian furore across of German-speaking Europe. Who are them? Where did they come from? And all that. And later scholarship, or we know that they're most likely the product of a fellow named Johann Valentine Andre, who was a Lutheran pastor at the German city of Tübingen then. And he said what it was what he called a hoax, but it was a serious hoax. It was a serious joke in the sense that, yes, there wasn't any kind of secret cabal of actual people, in a room deciding things. But the whole idea was that if you, like we do, share these ideals, if you, like us, would like to be free of the Habsburgs' rule, if you would like to have a more tolerant, open, religious world, if you would like to have, free education, as it were, if you would like to have more social freedom and so on, come join us. And so you didn't go and discover the Rosicrucians, or you did by becoming one. You became a Rosicrucian. So it was a serious joke in the sense it was a hoax, but it led to the idea was to lead to serious kind of actual, practical realities in the world. And some people did. The sad thing about the whole Rosicrucian experiment was that it came to naught at a famous battle called the Battle of the White Mountain, when they actually tried to rise up as a kind of not only political but a military force against the Habsburgs, and they were defeated. And then there's what I call the Rosicrucian diaspora, like the Hermetic diaspora, which is something that happens with these things. That they're working at a certain place, they're concentrated, then history happens and bang, and then it dissipates out into the world and it collects later on. And what happens then is that the 30 Years' War starts, and so the Rosicrucians, or the people that are trying to be Rosicrucians, and many people tried to find them, like Descartes and Leibniz and so on, but they spread out. And one of them is a fellow named Johann Comenius, who was Bohemian, the area that we know now is like the Czech Republic. And he's not as well known in the West as he should be, but he took this notion of a sort of universal education and the kind of sharing of knowledge that was part of the Rosicrucian sort of creed very seriously. And he is known as the father of modern education, father of modern, sort of free education. There's a UNESCO award in honor of him. I think in Hungary, there's like a national holiday, and there's several universities and so on like that. He was asked to be the first president of Harvard. And in any case, I should go quickly, but it was out of his kind of efforts to spread this Rosicrucian notion of free education that in the long run, eventually influences from that led to the foundation of what was known as the Royal Society, and still around today. It's the most prestigious scientific society in the world. And although the science that's associated with it today would reject much of what the Rosicrucians were about, its initial some of the initial people involved shared some of these ideas because they were sort of agents of Comenius. And another person who was involved in the setting up the Royal Society was a fellow named Elias Ashmole. And if you know the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, it's this fantastic collection. And he was sort of like a kind of like later on Rosicrucian kind of wannabe. And he collected lots of texts and this wonderful occult library and all that. But he's also important because he was one of the first on record Freemasons, or people outside of the actual operative side of Masonry. We talked about Freemasons a little bit in the previous lecture. We're talking about the building of the Gothic cathedrals and how there's good reason to suspect that there's quite a bit of hermetic and esoteric sort of emblems and iconography built into the decorative motifs in the cathedrals. And they're called Freemasons because the stone in which the decorative, not really decorative, but the iconographic stuff is done it's a freer stone. It's a softer kind of stone than the other stone that was supporting the buildings. And so there are no freestone masons and eventually Freemasons, and you had to have a special expertise to work in that. And so even just within this historical part of it, they developed a kind of secret way to recognize each other so that not everybody got those jobs. And again, there's some strange transformation in the 18th century where suddenly people who have nothing to do with the actual hands-on experience of being Masons become interested in the symbolic aspect, or the transposition of the kind of carving, the four square and solid and the sacred geometry involved in putting up the cathedrals. And there's also, legendary goes back to Solomon's temple with Hiram Abish and all that. This is transposed into the human temple, the human being as a temple, and the kind of work being done there. And out of that, this last fellow over here I'm going to have, just to try to get through the preliminaries, Baron Hund. And I'm having him here because as the Rosicrucians were known as the invisibles, they were hidden, nobody could find them. This is the notion of this esoteric tradition going underground. It's becoming it's a counterculture. Hermes Trismegistus has lost his street cred. The Rosicrucians can't be found. Baron Hood becomes the advocate of a kind of Freemasonry known as the rite of strict observance. And it's a very austere rite that involves higher esoteric kind of grades, and it also has links to some political radicalism going on about the time as the Jacobite movement to put a Stuart back on the throne. That's a whole other area, but the whole idea of the strict observance is that you in order to you have to pledge strict observance to what are known as hidden superiors. And these are chiefs that you don't know who they are. Anytime you meet them, they are masked, they're hooded and all that. So you have no idea who they are, but you have to pledge strict observance to them. And one of the people who is thought to have got involved in some aspect of that is, here we go, Emanuel Swedenborg, who was this fantastic Swedish scientist, and after midlife crisis, he went through visionary, although he was preparing for it quite some time. Swedenborg is one of these remarkable people. He's also one of these ones who was able to sort of bring both sides of the brain together, as it were, because he was a scientist. At the time, he wrote reams and reams and reams about anatomy, about the brain. Actually, he's one of the first ones to talk about neurons. He wrote a great deal about astronomy. He predicted quite a few things that are part of modern astrophysics and so on and so on. But he was also, although strict Swedenborgians don't like to talk about that this much, he was also studying a variety of different kind of esoteric practices. And he traveled quite a bit, and on one of his journeys to London here, where he lived quite some time, he got involved with a group of Moravians. And Moravians were a sect that grew out of the Bohemian Brethren, were one of these radical religious sects that had to escape Bohemia with the Rosicrucian diaspora because the Habsburgs were hunting them down and all that, and they found themselves in an area of Europe known as Moravia on the grounds of someone named Count Zinzendorf, and who's over here, and he became a convert to their creed. And it's fundamentally a kind of, I don't know, mystical experience of Jesus's love and heart and all that. But he develops a whole society known as the Society of the Mustard Seed. It was a kind of secret society. But the thing about the Moravians is that they actually worked a kind of, you could a kind of Christian tantra, because in actual practice, Zinzendorf developed a kind of sexual ritual involved with Jesus's body on the cross. And just to put it bluntly, obviously Jesus is a man, but the spear in his side created an additional organ, as it were. And so he had both bits. And so Jesus was androgynous. And I have to do this very quickly, but you could say the Moravians put the rave back in Moravia, because they here in London, they had a church on Fetter Lane. And there's a wonderful biography of William Blake by Peter Ackroyd, where he talks quite a bit about this group, because Blake got involved with the later, or Blake's parents were involved with them, but Swedenborg got involved with these people as well. And they practiced a kind of sexual mysticism. And if you know any Swedenborg's writings, late in life, in his 80s, he wrote a book called On Conjugal Love, and it's about how in heaven, the angels have sex, and it's the best sex they ever had, and all that. So he was not, particularly, how should we say, celibate and all that kind of thing. But in any case, he got involved with that. He was practicing that, but he also met this fellow named Rabbi Falk, and Rabbi Falk was a follower of Sabbatai Zevi, who was the false messiah, and also a Kabbalist. He was known as the Baal Shem Tov. He came from Galicia, Eastern Europe. And he had a kind of occult shop on the old London Bridge. And then in the East End of London, he had a house where he also taught a variety of different occult and Kabbalistic and erotic kind of mystical practices that Swedenborg also participated in. And these precipitated this transformation in Swedenborg in his 50s, where he went through this kind of spiritual crisis, and he started to be going on these journeys to heaven and hell. The angels, he would meet the angels at night, and they would come to him and take him to heaven, take him to hell, take him to other planets, Jupiter and Saturn, take him to this place called the spirit world, which is this intermediary place between heaven and hell, or between earth and your final destination, as it were, either one, heaven and hell. So Swedenborg, again, there's all these fantastic stories of his psychic powers. One of the most famous ones is where he's in a town, far away from Stockholm, and suddenly he knows there's a fire going on in Stockholm, and he kind of is aware of it for the next few hours, and then he breathes a sigh of relief, because he said, yes, it didn't reach my house, it was almost getting to my house. And then 3 days later, the mail coach comes and says, did you hear him? We told you about this fire, it was there, and it was exactly as he said. So Swedenborg had remarkable kind of psychic powers. He took these visionary journeys in this in-between state, the hypnagogic state I've talked about at different times, where in between sleeping and waking. All of us go through it twice a day, as you fall asleep and as you wake up. And if you know about it, you can pay attention and you can find a way to hover in there. He was apparently able to stay in the state for several hours at a time and go on these inner journeys. Okay, so some of Swedenborg's ideas, we talked about it kind of briefly, political radicalism with the Jacobite movement, got taken up by different people just before the French Revolution, and and blended with other people's ideas. And Swedenborg's ideas about the heaven and hell and the spirit world, which he would journey to in trance states, got blended during this time with the work of Franz Mesmer. Mesmer was a Bavarian German scientist, physician, although his doctorate was on the actual influence of the planets on human health. And influence, as you remember, the actual term influence comes from astrology. Influenza, it's this fluid coming down from the stars that enters us, and it's what affects us, and how the stars have the power over us. And if you remember Marsilio Ficino, he developed this whole talismanic kind of magic so that you could choose which influences you wanted to, we weren't slaves to it. We could be able to manipulate it. And Mesmer had a similar idea, and it's what he developed, what he called animal magnetism. And what he meant by animal was not so much going back to the beasts, although this is what he was accused of, because he did bring out the animal in most of his patients. But what he meant was this animated magnetism. So it's the magnetism, it's the vital energy that animates living things, and we could take that back to the anima mundi of the Neoplatonists, the soul of the world. But he thought it was an actual kind of fluid, a kind of stream of energy that he learned how to be able to transmit through his hands. And so if you know the old pictures of hypnotists or Svengali, it's like something's coming out of the fingers and affecting you. And he was quite successful. He was very successful in Vienna, and then he got chased out because it was always a bit dubious. And the effect on particularly his female patients was quite ecstatic, let us say, at times, and they let themselves go. But he went to Paris, and he was very successful in Paris and all that, until there was a scientific commission. Benjamin Franklin was one of the members of it, that said, "Oh, there's no scientific evidence or measurable evidence of this kind of fluid." And this was true. I mean, Mesmer was wrong in what he thought he discovered. Although we have the term mesmerism, which we think of as another word for hypnotism. The hypnotism comes out of mesmerism because much later on, after Mesmer died, one of his followers discovered that, well, there's no kind of stuff coming out of my fingers or my eyes, putting this person to sleep. I'm putting him to sleep by making these passes. And this is somehow inducing what became known as a trance in them. And so Mesmer's fluid didn't exist, but the effect that he was achieving was real, but not through the means that he thought. But at the time, before the French Revolution, or leading up to it, people thought, okay, well, let us transpose, because Mesmer's ideas about psychic health, because the problem with the animal magnetism is that it's this fluid and it gets blocked in us in different places. And when it gets blocked, that's where ill health comes from. So he would have to put his patients through a crisis, a mesmeric crisis. And this was induced by, giving them the magnetic passes and all this stuff. And then there was like a kind of big tub of water that he had magnetized, or a tree that he had magnetized. And, the different patients would go and touch the tree or put the foot in the water or something like that. And then they were induced in some kind of crisis, which, was at times orgiastic, let us say. And so they say, well, perhaps society needs that as well. Perhaps society must go through some kind of crisis like this, and hence the idea of a revolution. So there were these societies of harmony that were built around taking Mesmer's ideas, and Swedenborg's as well, because they would have these women who were peculiarly susceptible to the trance state. They were known as the chrysiacs, and they would go into this kind of strange state, and they would make these predictions about what would happen. And these would guide some of the figures around at the time, pre-revolution. And one of the other people who was involved at the time was a fellow named Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, who was known as the unknown philosopher until he became too popular and he was outed. But he talked about this notion of the regeneration of man. Man had fallen from his, we all did, not just men, women too, we all did, had fallen from our spiritual state in a prior kind of innocence to this state of matter that we're in now. We must learn to regenerate. We must learn to rediscover this inner spark. And his ideas too blended with the others, Swedenborg's and Mesmer's, just before the onset of, and it had this real effect on the politics of the time. So one reason I'm pointing this out is to show that the occult and all this stuff wasn't something that was happening on the sidelines. It was very much in at the moment. And something else that was very, very important at this time was the Romantic movement, which gets its start towards the end of the 18th century. Blake is just sort of before it. He's not exactly romantic in the same way as the other ones were. But Blake too was someone who had access to the kind of intuitive knowledge of the powers of the imagination that we've seen already with people like Surowardi and Paracelsus. In fact, for Blake, everything's the imagination. What we see out in the world around us, he called this is, in the imagination, everything exists in its eternal form, which we see reflected in what he called the vegetable glass of nature. One of the fundamental distinctions between the way Blake saw the world and, again, the tradition that he's coming out of, and I'll get to in a second what that is that rather than the modern view, which pretty much is rooted in the philosopher John Locke, when he said that nothing is in the mind that wasn't first in the senses, meaning that the mind is a blank slate, tabula rasa, and then stuff comes in from outside, as I say in many lectures. It's like we just moved into a flat, it's unfurnished, and you have to go to IKEA and buy a bunch of stuff, and then, okay, then your flat's furnished. So when we're born, there's nothing, it's an empty flat, and then experience, starts furnishing it with stuff. And what Blake is saying, and what the Neoplatonics are saying before him, and other people are saying before him, is that no, there's a kind of interior, what do you want to say, form or a gestalt or a kind of form-making principle that reaches out into the world and gives that world shape. And rather than our minds reflecting the outer world is a reflection of our mind. The outer world is a reflection of the consciousness that is at work shaping it, And of course, at that time, Blake he wasn't even known. He was a madman. Again, this biography by Peter Ackroyd is very good because she shows you that Blake was part of this whole kind of occult milieu that was going on in London at the time. A variety of different things going on. The Moravians were one part of it. There was lots of other stuff too. And another one who's a bit later than Blake was Samuel Coleridge. And he's one of the first romantics, the lyrical ballads with he and Wordsworth, the ones that kind of get the romantic movement going. But whereas Wordsworth was a true nature poet, in fact, Blake gave Wordsworth a lot of grief about that. Coleridge wasn't really a nature poet. He was more interested in the interior world, as Blake was. But he was more of a metaphysician, and he actually read a lot of German philosophers, which we'll get on to. But both of them, Blake and Coleridge, studied under, as it were, this fellow here, Thomas Taylor. And Thomas Taylor is important because he did the first English translations of the Neoplatonic philosophers like Plotinus and Porphyry and Iamblichus and Proclus that we talked about in the first lecture, and also Plato and Aristotle and all that. So I mean, these things are just available on Amazon for us. But around this time, nobody had translated. You had to read Latin, or you had to read the Greek and all that. And he did all these translations, and he was known as the English Platonist. And as Kathleen Raine, the great poet and Blake scholar and essayist, who influenced my book, Learning Lost Knowledge Imagination, it was Taylor's ideas, or Taylor transmitted these Neoplatonic ideas to this intellectual circle at the time. Blake was one of them, Coleridge and others as well. And this romantic poetry that we used to get taught in school is informed with a lot of stuff, and that usually doesn't come out in any of the usual classes. This is something that you'd have to look for and all that. So some of the great English classics of literature that you took exams about were informed with this kind of Neoplatonic philosophy. And I mentioned the Germans, and Romanticism really starts with them, with Goethe, with his early novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, which is about a young guy who has a failed romance, and he's this poet, and he has this surging love of nature and all that, but he's just totally depressed because of the failed romance, so he blows his brains out. But Goethe wrote himself out of that. But Goethe developed, again, like Blake, Surowardi, Paracelsus, this discipline methodology of using the imagination in order to look deeper than just the surface level of the world. And if you know my book, Lost Knowledge Imagination, or if you saw the talk I gave for the Theosophical Society about the book, I talk about Goethe's, what he calls active seeing, and how he was able, he talked about his search for the Urpflanze, which is the primal plant. And what that is when Blake talks about the eternal forms of things that are reflected in the vegetable glass of nature, that's Goethe is saying, well, I'm going to look at that vegetable glass long enough until I see those eternal forms. And he did. He developed a methodology to do that, which he applied to his scientific pursuits. And Goethe was, was a poet, a dramatist, he was a statesman. He's one of the last Renaissance men, but he was actually a scientist as well. And Rudolf Steiner was someone who started his career by editing Goethe's scientific work. But his science was informed with this disciplined imagination where he felt that he could see the eternal forms of things. And he gave birth to a whole branch of study in Germany, which is known as Naturphilosophy. And it's not the same as natural science, because the whole idea was able to see nature as a reflection of the mind, as I just said, rather than our mind's a reflection of nature, the other way around. Nature is a reflection of the eternal verities, in the mind. And so Goethe sort of gave birth to a whole school of German philosophy known as Naturphilosophy. And people like Schubart and Carl Gustav Jung, and there's all the ones that nobody knows, anyone never reads about them. Or Schelling. Friedrich Schelling was like the most well-known. And the fundamental idea is, Schelling said that, nature is visible mind and mind is invisible nature. So it isn't the Cartesian split between inner and outer, both are a continuum. And we're the nexus of where both meet. But something else that was very important at this time was the beginning of what we know as sort of parapsychology. The German philosophers who were doing this Naturphilosophy, they were very interested in what we would call the paranormal, ghosts and visions and apparitions and premonitions and so on and so on. And this was stuff that the Enlightenment thinkers had just brushed over there. And one of the first people to collect and sort of document these things was this woman named Catherine Crowe, who was a Scots novelist, but she did this book called The Night Sight of Nature. And it's still very readable. It's one of these books you could, read a few pages and keep by your bedside, open it up, and it's this fantastic story. She collects all these different stories about apparitions and visions and precognitive dreams and so on and so on. And she read a lot in English translations of these German philosophers who were studying what we would call psychic phenomena and all that. And she packs it all together there. And around the same time that she was putting that material together, you have the Fox sisters starting up in Hydesville, New York. It's the beginning of Spiritism or spiritualism. The family, they're living in this house and up in Hydesville, upstate New York, in an area known as the Burnt Over District, because there were so many religious revivals. Hot gospel had come through town so many times, left it spiritually charred, as it were. And they hear these knocks, whatever, in the house over time, and they start calling it Mr. Splitfoot and all that. And I think it's the mother who decides, okay, well, look, I think she's the one who starts with, knock twice for yes and once for no, or whichever way it is. And they start asking questions, and the knocks answer the question. And it turns out to be the spirit of someone who was murdered by the previous owner of the house, and this turns into a whole scandal and all that. But this is the birth of the spiritualism movement, but spread like wildfire, not only over the Burnt Over District, but all the states and across the Atlantic to here, the UK, but also in France. And this fellow here is Hippolyte Rival, who was one of these encyclopedic French educationalists who followed the Pan-Sophic tradition in promoting free education for all. And he was somebody who knew everything about everything and gave lectures about all this. And he studied mesmerism. But it came to his attention that the daughters of a friend of his were doing automatic writing. They were getting some very interesting results. And so he studied them. And he became converted to what he called Spiritism. And he even changed his name because the spirit said, this is a name that you had in your past life, to Allan Kardec. And he developed his own particular branch of spiritualism that after his death in 1869, it lost popularity in Europe, but it became one of the major religions in South America, in Brazil particularly. And the distinction is that Spiritism believed in reincarnation, where sort of spiritualism in general sort of didn't. So back then, this is sort of this polemical debate between all that. But somebody, oh, well, okay, next, before we get to her, just on the way to her. At the same time as going on, in France then, we have this wonderful character here, Eliphas Levy, who starts out as Alphonse Louis Constant, and he's this wild radical socialist who's writing about feminism and socialism and attacks on the state and all that. And actually, when his young wife leaves him for the editor of one of the journals he's writing for, he goes through a personal transformation. And after meeting this strange character named Honor Wronski, who's this Polish eccentric esotericist who's developed this whole kind of numerological system called Messianism, which I can't even begin to go into. Constant has his transformation, and he decides that he's a Kabbalist, and he changes his name to Eliphas Levy, which is, he says, is the Hebrew equivalent of his name. And he writes all these fantastic books, Transcendental Magic, The History of Magic, and so on, which are chock full of wonderful errors. I mean, he's very bad. His Hebrew, he's absolutely knew Hebrew nothing at all, but it's all this fantastic stuff. And I mean, you can take him apart easily. A.E. Waite, who edited his books, is constantly having footnotes saying, "Oh my God, what a howler," and all that. But the thing is that he had this fantastic romantic vision about the history of magic and this tradition. And he saw it not as, conjuring and all that, but he talks about being a kind of spiritual pursuit and a spiritual quest. And he developed two very important ideas: the notion of the will and the imagination as central to the magician's work, and not worrying about all the paraphernalia. The fundamental things is the will and the imagination, because they can exert a force upon what he called the astral light. And this was kind of an upgrade of Mesmer's animal magnetism, and it was on its way to what we'll talk about soon, is the Akashic record. But the astral light was this kind of ubiquitous medium, fluid, ether that permeated everything, and it maintained a record of everything. And when we drifted into dreams and other kind of states of daydreaming or stuff like that, we can become totally hypnotized and mesmerized, as it were, by the contents of this. And so the magician must learn to discipline his imagination. Again, the discipline of the imagination. And Levy had acquired many followers, one of whom, or a colleague, was this interesting character, Edward Bulwer Lytton, who was a very, very popular novelist in the Victorian age. And he's responsible for the, two great lines: "The pen is mightier than the sword," and also "It was a dark and stormy night," which was the beginning of his novel Paul Clifford. And there used to be a contest to write, just like there used to be a Hemingway contest to write like a story like Hemingway, and I got up, I got down, I did this, I did that, this kind of flat Hemingway prose. There was a contest used to be to like start a story with a better line than "It was a dark and stormy night." But he's actually quite influential, Bulwer Lytton. He wrote The Last Days of Pompeii. And he was a radical at the time. But he was one of the early, like Catherine Crowe, actually kind of scientific investigators of what we would call paranormal phenomena. In this book of his called The Haunter in the Brain, it's a kind of scientific investigation of the haunted house. But he's also responsible for two very important kind of esoteric works, and one is Zanoni, which is this fantastic kind of mystical novel about Rosicrucians and sort of immortality and the French Revolution and all that. I can't go into it. It's one of these fantastically complicated 19th century plots. And the other one is The Coming Race over here, which has in many ways started this whole kind of genre of the hidden superior race that's going to eventually emerge and overtake the world. And there's a superior race, the Vril, and they lived underground. And the protagonist in the story, somehow he's a spelunker, so he finds himself in a cave, and then he somehow mysteriously finds himself in this world. And strangely enough, the women are in charge. It's kind of a matriarchy there. They're stronger. They're more virile, if you could say it that way. They become. He strangely gets into a relationship with one of the women there and all that, and he's able to learn from her about their world. But eventually, she has to let him go, otherwise they'll kill him. But again, this has been picked up by this whole kind of Nazi occult genre, because the vril power, the vril force, is this kind of psychic force that they have, and they can, do all sorts of things with it, and move things, and melt them, and all that kind of stuff. And this was supposed to be something that Hitler was trying to find, and that's this whole kind of weird genre down there. But so this was right before. Yes, this was happening right before the arrival of probably the most important character, I would say, not only because I'm saying this, I'm doing this talk for the Theosophical Society, but it's true. In terms of historical influence, is Madame Blavatsky, the incomparable HPV. And she inherits all the stuff we've just been talking about, Mesmer, and Saint Martin, and Levy, and Bulwer-Lytton, and all that. And she is a natural psychic, and we know the story. For the first 40 years of her life, she's on these incredible journeys around the planet, and some of which can be verified, and a great deal of which cannot, and whatever. But there's all that happens, and then she appears in 1873 in New York, in the Lower East Side, coming over on an immigrant ship. And then, this is when she steps into history, as it were. She is reading all these articles written by her chum, or soon-to-be chum, Colonel Alcott, for the series of spiritual appearances, manifestations happening in Vermont. And she decides, because she's, I don't think I have to tell too much about what she's is doing. She arrives in New York because she's been given the mission by the masters to bring the teaching, the secret doctrine, to the West, because the West is threatened with materialism, and it's the place where it's become the it's just, I always thought it was funny, like she's sent to the place it needed it the most, and it was New York City in 1873. So I guess that was where materialism was just like bang, had its most impregnable fortress, as it were, and she's sent there to bring the spiritual teachings about the truth of the higher worlds and all that. But she's a step up from the spiritualism. I mean, this whole idea that the whole spiritualist beginning, the Fox sisters and everything that came out of that, was somehow orchestrated by certain groups in the background, the Orphic Club, or the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor. There's a wonderful book by Jocelyn Godwin called The Theosophical Enlightenment, where he talks about this sort of thing. So that's a whole kind of backstory that's going on. If you know your history of Madame Blavatsky, she was involved with both of them to some degree. But she's different than the spiritualist because she's not just the medium. The medium is a conduit for the spirits to come and speak through. She's a magician because she can control them. And she wins over Alcott because she starts making things happen in Chittenden in Vermont, rather than and suddenly there's Russians there, Kalmucks and all that. They used to just be like Red Indians. I'm sorry for the politically incorrect term, but that was what it was said at the time, and all that. And so long story short, they hit it off really well, and in 1875. With some others, they decide to start a society in order to explore these sorts of things, and that's the beginning of the Theosophical Society. And then she writes, we all, the general idea is, it's like, the journey to the East. The Secret Doctrine is more about that, and their interest in Buddhism, esoteric Buddhism. Before that, it's the Egyptian theme. It's the Western mysticism. And I have to say, personally, I kind of prefer Isis Unveiled to the Secret Doctrine because it's like a grab bag of what was happening at the time and what books different people were reading and what ideas were going on at the time. And it's one of the first big compendiums of kind of psychic occult kinds of stuff. I see like I have to rush off very quickly here because I'm only probably halfway through, and I got a few minutes before we get to.
You can take a little bit of time.
Okay, I'm going to go quickly. Okay, and then again, the other big book is The Secret Doctrine. And if if one of the things the lines I use, because I've written a book about Madame Blavatsky and I've written about her in very different places, but there's a line about Russian literature. If you know Russian literature, if you know Nikolai Gogol, there's a story of his called The Overcoat. And it's a strange story about someone losing their overcoat in St. Petersburg, and I can't go into it. But the reason I bring it up is because someone at one point said all of modern Russian literature came out of Gogol's overcoat. So I would say that all of modern esoteric, thinking or whatever comes out of Madame Blavatsky's rather ample bosom, to put it there, if I'm not being too rude about that. But I mean, everything that comes in the modern world comes out of theosophy. I'm just saying, that's why I say, she's as important, I would say, as a architect of the modern world as someone like Darwin or Marx or Freud. That's not, and I'm not equating her thought with theirs. It's just the effect on Western society at the time, the effect on it, because many people were attracted to this doctrine. We know that Edison, Abner Doubleday, Vasily Kandinsky, L. Frank Baum, many important people in culture and science, even in politics, were attracted to the Theosophical Society in the early days, and it had a tremendous influence. Whatever you might think of the actual doctrines of theosophy, the influence it had in, I would say, starting what we know as a kind of grassroots spirituality, in many ways in the same way, but in a wider application than the kind of lay mysticism that someone like Meister Eckhart was involved in back in the 1200s, where there were like secular groups that were very interested in these kinds of things. And this is what Madame Blavatsky did, I think, on a larger scale. At the same time, and something gets going that she had some contact with, the Society for Psychical Research. This starts up in around 1882, and it's founded by these three figures here, Frederick Myers, Henry Sidgwick, and Edmund Gurney. And basically, it's the idea carried over from Catherine Crowe and the German nature philosophers before her, Catherine Crowe, then Edward Bowe-Lytton, to let's try and have a scientific, rigorous investigation of these kind of phenomena. And fundamentally, it's motivated by the idea: religion seems to be on its way out. Science can't tell us anything about the soul. It's actually rather perhaps inadvertently, but in any case, it's actually doing the opposite. It's undermining the notion of the soul. Can we find any kind of support for the idea of the soul, or what happens? Who are we? Are we just random events in this meaningless universe, which seems to be the case? Science seems to be heading towards. And can what's happening in the seance with mediums help us in any way? So they get together and they do this, and it becomes something, again, like the Theosophical Society, that attracts many of the most prestigious minds at the time. I mean, if you look at the list of not only members, but presidents of the Society for Psychical Research, you'll see many Nobel Prize winners in there and things of that sort. So unlike today, where you can't really talk about this stuff openly as a scientist and not be laughed at or be worried about your career, although some do. We know that some are established, Rupert Sheldrake and others like that. But it's sort of like you can't really talk about it in academia until you get tenure. Back then, William James, the great American philosopher, Henri Bergson, I talked about in one talk, great French philosopher, a Nobel Prize winner. They were openly very interested in all of that. So it was a remarkable time, and it's only a little bit more than 100 years ago. So it's not that far away from ours. Something else that comes out of Theosophy is probably the most famous magical society at the time, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And William Butler Yates, the great Irish poet and Nobel Prize winner, he starts out as a Theosophist. He joins the Theosophical Society in Dublin, or some branch of it. And then when he came to London, he was involved there. He actually meets Madame Blavatsky. Gandhi isn't somebody else who meets Madame Blavatsky around this time. But he gets involved, and he has a wonderful account of meeting with her. And he thought she was like some old Irish peasant woman who had this wonderful sense of humor and this kind of just vibrant life around her and all that. And she must have been a real madcap to be around. I can't imagine. But he gets kicked out of the Theosophical Society because he's interested in ceremonial magic. And Madame Blavatsky detested ceremonial magic. She didn't like magic. So in that sense, it was somehow one of these things that she thought was, the Dark Brotherhood was involved in that, for whatever reasons. But so he gets kicked out, and he joins what's known as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is a smaller group. It's not as well known as the Theosophical Society, but it's devoted to studying magic, the ancient Hermetic texts, and also sort of Christian Kabbalism that came out of the Renaissance, and a variety of other things. And one of the people involved at the time was this character here, Samuel Little McGregor Mathers, who he had sort of the essentials that you need to be a really great musician, where he had this indomitable kind of will and a very vivid imagination, almost reaching to a tenuous grasp on reality, because he was a great kind of self-dramatizer. And he pretended to have like Scottish roots, but he was never up there until sometime later in life and all that. He liked to dress up in sort of military uniform. He was a military historian too, and a kind of study of military strategies. That was his other great love. But he seemed to be actually a very powerful magician, as it were. And one of the things was, Yates talks about hidden superiors, and he refers back to Rabbi Falk, if you remember him from the Swedenborg bit, as one of the sort of people from whom this tradition has descended. But Mathers talked about the secret chiefs, and these are sort of like the Mahatmas. They were people on another plane, and they were on another dimension. And he talks about making contact with them was like the effect of as if a lightning bolt struck near you and you had inhaled ether. Now, not having had that experience, I can't quite say exactly what that's like, but it must have been quite remarkable. And this is how he maintained control over the other members of the Hermetic Order Golden Dawn until this fellow arrived here, Aleister Crowley. He was known as the Great Beast, 666, and all of that, and has this wonderful stare here that's like really served him well. There's a whole story behind Crowley. I don't have the time to go into it, but he's basically this rich kid who grew up in a Plymouth Brethren, which is basically a Christian fundamentalist family. And everything was denied him until he came of age, got his inheritance, and he ran with it. And he thought himself a poet. Actually, there's a famous story of he and Yates having this kind of, bust up because Crowley showed Yates some of his poetry, and Yates just mumbled some non-committal stuff. And Crowley was absolutely convinced that he realized that Crowley was a much better poet than Yates, and he would never be, in any case. But Crowley decided that at one point, after having this kind of wild life already as a mountaineer and a poet and world traveler, that he wanted to study magic. And so he learned of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and he went and he joined. And he was, according to Yates and others, quite an obnoxious character. And he moved to the ranks quite quickly, but he basically annoyed everybody. And at this point, Mathers was living in Paris, and when Yates and the others denied Crowley the next step up in the magical hierarchy, if you remember the Tree of Life, that's how the Golden Dawn hierarchy worked. They did certain grades according to the Sephiroth in the Tree of Life, and you had to pass certain kind of tests and so on and so on. And so when Yates denied Crowley the next, the next kind of merit badge on the Kabbalistic Tree of Life, he went over to Paris, and Mathers initiated him, and then he became Mathers' kind of agent, and Mathers was trying to get rid of the other guys and regain control, and it all ended up with everything falling apart. But again, Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn is something out of which a great deal of modern esotericism. And speaking of modern esotericism, this is the period what I call the golden age of modern esotericism. We're heading into it. He dies in 1891. Alcott becomes the head for a while, but he's more of an administrative kind of character, great organizer, but he doesn't have the kind of charisma or the contact with the Mahatmas, the hidden masters. And in 1907, Annie Besant becomes the head. She was already converted in 1890 when she met Madame Blavatsky when she was living not too far from where I live here in London, over an Avenue Road in St. John's Wood. And Besant, if you know her earlier career, she was a wild radical suffragette, socialist thinker, the match girl strike, and she got arrested for promoting contraception and a variety of other things. And she was sent to interview Madame Blavatsky when The Secret Doctrine came out and to review it. And after talking with her, Madame Blavatsky said, "Oh, Miss Besant, if only you would come among us." And apparently Besant melted and said, "Oh, I will," and joined. And she became, soon, became, soon was the leader of the most powerful member in it. And she didn't have the hotline to the Mahatmas. I don't have the picture of him up. I should have, but Charles Leadbeater was the one who did. He was a more mystic. He claimed he knew Madame Blavatsky. He claimed to have had his own contact with the masters, and HPB wasn't too sure about that, and so on and so on. But he's the one who finds Jiddu Krishnamurti on the banks of the river and is immediately taken with him in his aura. And Leadbeater is able to read the auras, the past lives of these people, and he saw that Krishnamurti had great sort of spiritual heritage, and he is the new avatar of the new age. He's the incarnation of the new spiritual truth of the age, and they begin promoting him as such. And one person who isn't quite taken with this is Rudolf Steiner over here. Rudolf Steiner, as I mentioned, started out as a Goethe scholar. He was an all-round general, very good, Germanic scholar, Herr Professor, Doctor type, earnestness incarnate, very sober. And he was offered, as a young man, the job of editing Goethe's scientific works, but which nobody wanted because the scientists thought it was rubbish and the literature people thought it was boring. But he totally disagreed, Steiner did, and he developed Goethe's notion of active seeing, when he was talking about Goethe seeing the Urpflanze, into what Steiner called the supersensible perception. And he bought, but in 1900, he's asked to speak to the Theosophical Society in Berlin, and he hits it off. He gives them a talk. I'm trying to remember which one the first one was. I think it was about Nietzsche, actually. But then he gave a talk about this fairy tale of Goethe's. This fairy tale that Goethe wrote, and it's this kind of weird, alchemical, strange, almost surrealist kind of story, which doesn't really come to any kind of point, but it's full of all the symbolism. And Steiner was a hit. He was absolutely a hit. And all along, he had psychic experiences. He tells a story as a young boy, like Paracelsus, like Jakob Böhme. He was able to see into the heart of nature. He was able to see the spirits. He actually personified them, the sort of nature spirits and the leaves and the trees and the mountains and all this kind of thing. And he also tells a story. His father worked for the railway, and he spent a lot. He was home educated, as we would say, quite a bit, and he spent a lot of time in the sort of the station where his father was working. And he tells a story one day, this woman appearing out of nowhere and says to him, "Please help me now." And later on in life, and then she walked into the stove and disappeared. And this was some vision he later found out, of a relative who committed suicide then. So Steiner had these kind of visions, but he kept mum about it, kept them to himself, until he basically starts lecturing to the Theosophical Society, and then he realizes, this is an audience to which I can talk about these things. And so he rises in the ranks, and he becomes the head of the German branch and all that. And he has his own particular approach, which is much more Western, it's much more Christianized. He brings in a lot of German philosophy. He brings in a lot of Goethe. And this remarkable building here, which sadly burned down on Christmas Eve, and I think, or New Year's Eve, 1922. And it was built during World War I, with people working on it from all the different warring nations, and it's in Switzerland. And this is the Goethe Arnhem, and it's in the Goethe building, as it were, the Goethe temple. And it's remarkable flowing forms and organic shapes and all that. And Steiner, just I said, he took Goethe's ideas and ran with it and developed this whole other kind of system, which he called anthroposophy, which is, rather than the wisdom of the gods, it's the wisdom of man. And he claimed it's some kind of Rosicrucian tradition, but the central difference is that it's not Eastern oriented. There's Christ and the Western tradition is the central kind of anchor of it here. And something else happens at this time, which again, this is always why I say it's this kind of the golden age of modern esotericism. Coming in from Russia is what became known as the Fourth Way. And somebody else who came out of Theosophy was Peter Ouspensky. Peter Ouspensky is Gurdjieff's main disciple, the main exponent. You know, his remarkable book, In Search of Miraculous, is the clearest exposition of Gurdjieff's ideas at the time. And it's also a wonderful adventure story of how they escaped from this exploding Russia. You know, I just did a book that came out earlier this year called The Return of Holy Russia, and Russia during the World War I and then to the revolution and the Civil War. It was during all that happening, erupting around them, that first Ouspensky went on his own search for the miraculous. He went to India, he went to Egypt, he went to the Holy Land, and all this because he believed that underneath or hidden, there is this real esoteric tradition. And there's still some places where it's kept alive, and there's schools, esoteric schools. And he got a lot out of Theosophy, but he felt like it had kind of hardened and it kind of turned into a kind of static form. And he wanted to sort of make contact with the sources. And there's a wonderful story. He went to Adyar and he to the Theosophical Society there. And they had this kind of hierarchy where the ground floor was just, hangers on, anybody coming hanging out, with your backpack and you slept on the floor or something like that. The second floor was for people who made financial contributions and, they were treated much better and all that. But the third floor of the HQ there was reserved for the real, celebrities. And Ouspensky always, liked to tell the story that he was taken right up to the third floor because he was a very well-known writer in Russia he for journals and newspapers and his own books, and he wrote books about the fourth dimension and the tarot and cosmic consciousness and all this kind of thing, and he gave lectures on that. So he got this commission from different newspapers in Russia to go on this journey to the east, as Hermann Hesse would call it in his later novel. And he tried to meet up with different schools, and he met interesting people and yogis and gurus and all that, but he came back feeling like he didn't really make the contact that he wanted to make. And what happened was that this fellow here, G.I. Gurdjieff, the enigmatic Armenian Greek, you're not quite sure exactly what his nationality was or when he was born. He was reading Ouspensky's articles in the newspapers he was writing. And he wanted to snare Ouspensky in the same way that Madame Blavatsky wanted to snare Alcott. They both needed a good, sober, straight man, front man who could help, organize and turn all their ideas into something that's, quite clear and transmissible. And Gurdjieff started sort of, he like Blavatsky, his early life is shrouded in mystery. He was born in a place that was called Gumru at one point, and then Alexandropol, because it was the Greeks or the Russians owned it at different times. It was one of these times, and we're not quite sure when he was born, 1866, 1872, 1877, all these different dates come up. But he grew up in this kind of ethnic, multilingual melting pot in this strange part of, sort of Central Asia. Then appeared, if you know his book, Meetings with Remarkable Men, this is where he tells the story of his youth and his journeys into Central Asia and his search for hidden knowledge, just like Blavatsky went, around the world looking for it like that and so on. Ouspensky went himself, and all that. And then he appears in Moscow around 1915, and some of his students, ensnare Ouspensky, and they insist that he must meet this certain G, and he meets him. And then Ouspensky, he's just come back from the East, and he did it, and then he meets this guy, and they meet in this kind of cheap cafe, like a Greasy Spoon Cafe somewhere, like in London. And he's totally, oh God, this is it. This is the guy I wanted to meet. And Gurdjieff is the man who knows. He's one of the most remarkable characters out of all this vast array of remarkable characters. His own being, he radiates kind of power and energy. He seems to have gone to all the places that Ouspensky wanted to go to. He seems to know the things. Ouspensky was a very rigorous and a logical thinker, and he wanted to find a system. he had experiences of cosmic consciousness. He had experiences of, altered states, but he wanted to find a system that would lead one to be able to have them, at will, consciously, not just haphazard. He tried a variety of different things, and Gurdjieff seemed to be the one who provided that. But it was a very austere system, a very Spartan regime, and it was based on the whole idea that we are asleep. We think we're awake, but we're not really awake. We think we have free will, but we're really machines. And the first thing we have to do is realize that we're asleep, and we have to realize that we're machines. And Gurdjieff went out of his way to drum that in to a variety of people over the years that worked with him. Uspensky was with him for a relatively short time, a few years, and then very different types. They had to split. He had to go and he set up his own thing. He always acknowledged that Gurdjieff was the originator, or at least the transmitter of these ideas. It's unclear whether did Gurdjieff make it up. Did he really get this teaching from the Sarmung Brotherhood, which is this hidden brotherhood like Blavatsky's Mahatmas in Central Asia? Was he this fantastic improvisationist who made it up as he went along? It's hard to tell. It's hard to know when he's pulling your leg. And again, Blavatsky's like that too. They're great cosmic jokers. I mean, they would say things to the nodding head true believers who would just take whatever they said as truth, and then they would go, "Oh Jesus, that's not what we want," and that kind of thing. But this poster here is for Gurdjieff. All along, always wanted to set up what he called the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man, and he tried to do that in a variety of different places. And this was a poster when he was in Tiflis, or Tbilisi, which is an area in the Caucasus in Russia, when they were escaping from the wave of catastrophe of the Russian Revolution and all that. And 100 years ago, Uspensky and Gurdjieff were refugees and immigrants in refugee and immigrant accommodations in Constantinople, which is Istanbul now, trying to get into Europe. So just like people are trying to get in over the boats or through the borders and all that, they were trying to get in because they were escaping from, the catastrophe of the Russian Revolution. And Uspensky came to London. He found the miraculous because his book Tertium Organum had been translated into English and it became a bestseller. He didn't know. And he suddenly got a royalty check out of nowhere and an invitation to come to London, money no question, from Lady Rothermere, who was the wife of a big newspaper baron at the time. So he came to London, and then Gurdjieff eventually started what was known as he started his institute at this prairie in Fontainebleau, in the forest of Fontainebleau outside of Paris. And this is where people worked on themselves, and he developed this arduous system of physical labor and regime and all this kind of thing with psychological exercises and a cosmological teaching. And if you know any of the books about Gurdjieff at this time, it was a remarkable thing. But one of the people who went there, it's a nice segue, is a fellow named Maurice Nicoll. And Maurice Nicoll later wrote these collection of some 7 books called Psychological Commentaries on the teachings of Gurdjieff and Uspensky. But he started out as a disciple of this gentleman, of Carl Jung. And Freud here, because, Freud was, Freud and Jung had this relationship, one of the great kind of friendships and then antagonistic relationships that devastated and also both men profited by and all that. But Jung starts out as a Freudian, but then Jung himself always had an interest in the paranormal, psychic. His mother was psychic. It ran in his family. He attended seances as a young man. He based his dissertation on the psychological roots of so-called occult phenomena, or something along those lines, and all that. But again, this is part of the golden age, what I call the modern esotericism, because famously Jung went through this crisis after the breakup with Freud. He and Freud were close friends for 7 years, but Jung could never accept Freud's insistence on the sexual traumas being the root of all neuroses, and Jung had a much more religious and spiritual view of the human psyche, and he felt that what was often the case going on in neuroses and all that was a kind of lack of a kind of spiritual dimension in the life. But when he had this bust up with Freud, he was cast out. He was cast out into the wilderness, in the psychoanalytical wilderness, as it were, and he went through, depending how you look at it, the Night Sea journey or a psychotic breakdown. But one of the products of that was the Red Book, which was only published about 10 years ago, and there's more stuff's come out recently. The Black Books were, and the Red Book and the Black Books are these journals that Jung kept of this period when he was going through this psychic trauma, in which he created these incredible watercolor paintings, and the stories, the narratives he writes in this fantastic calligraphy are like the kind of inner journeys that Suhrawardi was going on back in Aleppo, in the 1100s or whenever that was, and Swedenborg was going on to heaven and hell, and Rudolf Steiner in a different way was going on when he was checking out the Akashic record, or Blavatsky was doing that. They were all taking these interior journeys, but Jung was catapulted into it through this this episode, because he was going through a traumatic emotional eruption, and he had all these visions and premonitions and all that. But what he discovered was that there were people living in his head. And this is the kind of thing that people used to go to Jung about. Doctor, I'm talking to these people in my head. And so, but he found himself doing that. But they were telling him, one of them was Philemon, which he became his inner guru, and it was Salome and some others, Elijah. And they were telling him that you think your thoughts and images in your head belong to you, but you share all this. This is like a forest. You are one person in the forest, and there's lots of trees and animals and others here that nothing to do with you. This is an objective realm. And what became popular was Jung's idea of the collective unconscious, which is this kind of reservoir of images and symbols, and like Goethe's primal phenomena that we inherit psychically. But later in life, he used this other term, objective psyche, which I prefer, because it means that our minds, the shallows of our minds deal with just us personally. The deeper we go in, we start to connect with something that's a whole other dimension, which is the inner journey that Suhrawardi went on, or Blake went on, or these other people went on. Jung found it in this other way, and he created these fantastic images. And one of the things he discovered was that these images, these mandalas, which is the Sanskrit word for magic circle, where they were kind of gauges of his psychic state at the time. And this is during World War I. He was Swiss, so he wasn't involved in the actual battle, but he was in charge of a prisoner of war camp, people that came over the border from either side. And he would paint these each day, one of these mandalas, and it would somehow be a reflection of his own inner state, or the kind of projective movement towards that. And Jung here, he became, Freud died, Adler died. He became the best, the most famous living psychiatrist at the time. But as early as 1940, I mean, Jung, he always had this interest in the occult, alchemy. We all know something he wrote quite a bit about. Gnosticism, he wrote quite a bit about. And in the strange book Aeon that he wrote in the early 50s, he starts talking about the age of Aquarius. He's one of the first one. I mean, there's people earlier, Gerald Massey and some others, but in terms of, high-profile people, Jung, he's the most famous psychologist at the time. He starts talking about the age of Aquarius, and in 1940, and he sees this is on its way. It's based on the precession of the equinoxes. This is the different constellations that come over the horizon at spring, when the sun rises at spring, and it's unclear exactly when Aquarius is going to hit. It's on its way. Okay, I'll try. I got. Okay, it's on its way. It's pretty soon. But he's talking about this, and we have all this stuff happening, and that sort of is leading us there. And let's go over it very quickly. The flying saucer phenomenon starts up in the late 40s with Kenneth Arnold seeing these strange objects in the sky when he's flying his plane over in Washington State, and this kicks off this whole other thing. 54, Huxley kicks off the psychedelic kind of revolution with his writing about his experience with mescaline, which sends him into a state in which he too, like Paracelsus in Burma and these others, can see into the heart of nature. He uses Meisterkoch's term Istigkeit, talking about the isness of things. He can just see these things in these Satori-like epiphanies. And then a big book that really kicks off the occult revival appears in France in 1960, called The Morning of the Magicians, Le Matin des Magiciens. And in the middle of kind of black and white Sartre and Camus, Simone de Beauvoir, existentialist Paris, or even smoking Galois. You have this, suddenly it's a book about flying saucers and the occult and Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and Gurdjieff and all this kind of stuff out of nowhere. And it becomes this huge bestseller. And it's translated to English a couple of years later, and it's an equal bestseller in the UK and the States as well. And, things get rolling. Timothy Leary picks up from Huxley, and he starts the psychedelic revolution really going, where Huxley and others want to keep it kind of quiet, and people can experiment with these things quietly, and we can learn about them. Leary wants to turn into a whole kind of social movement, and he wants to be the head of this, the guru of the psychedelic generation, and he gets a lot of mileage out of it. Who turns up on the cover of the Beatles album? We got Jung, he's on there. Aleister Crowley's on there. So the most famous people in the world by the mid-60s are really into the stuff that's been on the margins, for the last 400 years. And they're all talking about magic and occultism and mysticism and all that. And and it becomes the Age of Aquarius is a big hit. It's a big hit on Broadway. It's a #1 song. The Fifth Dimension. This is the dawning of the Age of Aquarius. I grew up when I was a kid. It was on the radio and I went to school in the morning. So all this stuff that was like way out there on the fringe is suddenly the most popular thing in town. And it leads us again into the 70s, the New Age, all that kind of starts happening. We have the Findhorn movement, the Aquarian conspiracy. These are old books, folks. If you're of a certain age, you might remember. Shirley MacLaine, like the Beatles, she's a famous celebrity who starts talking about her past lives and channeling and crystals, and it becomes immensely popular. This is a shot of a bookshop I was working in at the time in the late 80s called the Bodhi Tree Bookshop in West Hollywood in LA. And it was, it was Mystic Central. Everybody was there. It was the safest place on the planet, I was told, because this is the beginning of what was known as the harmonic convergence. This was this psychic social event happened in 1987, the culmination of which was supposed to be 2012, 25 years later. So we find ourselves here now, and I would say we are in a position where there's been a movement, a broad movement for this other side of us that was, put aside for good reasons a while ago on the margin, but it keeps creeping in. It doesn't go away. It doesn't go away because it's part of us. We can't just rip out the other side of our brain or the other side of our soul or all that. So we have to somehow integrate the two. And here we have it in terms of the brain. Here we have it in terms of yin yang. And here we have it in terms of William Blake. And on that note, I'll let you think about it. Let me run away for a second, and I'll be right back. Thank you very much.